When they lifted her off the truck, the smell hit them first. Then they saw the maggots crawling out from under her uniform. She'd been rotting alive for 19 days. The morning of June 22nd, 1945, arrived hot and still over Camp Concordia, Kansas. The kind of heat that made the wheat fields shimmer in waves that turned the air itself into something you could almost see. 6:15 in the morning, and already the temperature was climbing past 80 degrees. In 3 hours it would be unbearable. But the men unloading the transport truck from New Jersey didn't notice the heat. They were too busy trying not to vomit. Before we go further, every day we create stories like this one. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected moments that change everything. If you want to make sure you never miss another one, hit that subscribe button now. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. That morning in Kansas, 68 pounds of dying girl arrived at Camp Concordia. Her name was Greta Hoffman. She was 19 years old, and she was barely conscious. 2 guards carried her through the gates of the prisoner of war hospital, their faces turned away from the stretcher, breathing through their mouths. One of them, a farm boy from Iowa who'd seen plenty of death in the war, would later say it was the worst thing he'd ever smelled. Worse than the beaches at Normandy. Worse than the boxcars they'd opened at Dachau. This was the smell of a human body consuming itself of flesh, surrendering to rot while the heart still beat. The stretcher bearers moved quickly across the compound yard, past rows of identical wooden barracks painted the same dusty brown as the Kansas earth. Past the mess hall, where the smell of frying bacon drifted out into the morning air. Past the recreation yard, where German prisoners played cards in the shade, their war over their futures uncertain, but their bodies whole. They carried Greta to the infirmary at the far end of the compound and set her down with visible relief on the examination table in the receiving room. The duty medic that morning was Elliot Brennan, 23 years old, from a wheat farm outside Grand Island, Nebraska. Dark curly hair, brown eyes that held a perpetual sadness, hands that were steady, even when his heart wasn't. His grandparents had fled the pogroms in Russia in 1905, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but the clothes they wore and a prayer book his grandmother clutched like a life raft. They'd made their way to Nebraska, to the flat, endless prairie where you could see tomorrow coming from miles away. Elliot's grandmother had taught him German. Not the high German of the cities, but the Yiddish-inflected German of the shtetls, full of warmth and humour and 1,000 years of survival. She'd taught him the language while kneading bread at the kitchen table, while hanging laundry in the backyard, while watching the wheat grow tall in the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Learn this," she'd told him. "Know where you come from. Know who you are." He knew who he was. He was a medic, a healer. It was the only thing that made sense to him in a world gone mad with killing. When the guards set the stretcher down, Elliot was already washing his hands at the sink, preparing for what he assumed would be another routine intake. Camp Concordia held 4,000 German prisoners, most of them healthy men who worked the Kansas farms and factories, earning 80 cents a day and 3 meals that were better than what they'd eaten in years. Medical cases were usually minor. Infections, broken bones from work accidents, the occasional appendicitis. This was not routine. The smell reached him before he turned around. It bypassed thought, went straight to instinct, to the primitive part of the brain that says danger, disease, death. Elliot turned from the sink water still dripping from his hands and saw what was lying on the examination table. At first his mind couldn't process it. The figure was so small, so wasted, that it looked more like a child than a woman. The uniform, what was left of it, was stiff with dried blood, and something else, something dark and organic that had soaked through the fabric and crusted in irregular patterns. The face was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under closed eyes. The breathing was shallow, rapid like a bird's, but it was the bandages that stopped him cold. Crude, improvised bandages wrapped around the torso, made from strips of torn cloth that might have once been part of the uniform itself. And the bandages were moving, not from breathing, from something else, something crawling beneath the fabric. "Jesus Christ," one of the guards muttered. "We didn't know. We just thought she was sick. They loaded her on the truck in Jersey 3 days ago. She hasn't said a word the whole trip." Elliot approached the table slowly, his medic's training overriding his revulsion. He'd seen terrible wounds in his 2 years of service. He'd held intestines in place while surgeons worked. He'd watched men die from injuries that should have been survivable. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to lock away emotion and focus only on what needed to be done. But this required every ounce of that discipline. "Help me cut these away," he said to the guards. His voice was steady. That surprised him. The guards looked at each other, then back at Elliot. "We're just transport, Doc. We're supposed to—" "Now," Elliot said. Not loud, but with enough command that both men moved to the table. They used trauma shears to cut through the uniform, working from the shoulders down, being as gentle as they could with fabric that had essentially fused to skin in places. The woman on the table, Greta, didn't open her eyes, but Elliot saw her jaw clench, saw the muscles in her neck go rigid, saw her hands ball into fists at her sides. She was conscious, she was aware, and she was trying not to scream. When they reached the bandages, Elliot took over. The guards stepped back, happy to be excused, and he couldn't blame them. He cut through the first layer. Dried blood had glued it to the layer beneath. He worked slowly, methodically, using saline solution to soften the adhesions, peeling back each layer, with the care of an archaeologist, uncovering something precious and fragile. The smell got worse with each layer. Decay, infection, the sweet, sick odor of necrosis, and something else. Something that made Elliot pause and force himself to breathe through his mouth. The smell of living things feeding on dead flesh. The final layer of bandage came away. Elliot set it aside carefully, his hands not quite steady anymore. And then he saw. The wound was massive. A jagged gash that ran diagonally across her lower back from just below the left shoulder blade down to the right hip. 12 inches long, maybe more. The edges were swollen, inflamed, weeping clear fluid mixed with pus. But worse, far worse, was what filled the wound itself. The flesh there was black and green necrotic tissue that had been dying for weeks, and crawling through it, over it, in it, were hundreds of maggots. Small white larvae writhing and pulsing with obscene vitality. Elliot stepped back involuntarily. His breakfast rose in his throat, and he swallowed hard, forcing it down. In his peripheral vision, he saw one of the guards stumble for the door hand over his mouth. The other guard had gone pale, swaying where he stood. But Elliot couldn't look away. Because even as his stomach churned, even as every instinct screamed at him to turn away from this horror, his medic's training was cataloguing what he saw. The shrapnel wound clearly from an explosion. The crude self-treatment, the tourniquet that had been tied around her upper torso, probably saving her life by slowing the spread of infection. The fact that she was still breathing, still conscious after carrying this wound for 19 days. And the maggots. God help him, the maggots. They were eating the dead tissue, cleaning the wound in the only way nature knew how. Without them, the infection would have spread faster, the necrosis would have consumed more healthy tissue, the sepsis would have killed her days ago. The maggots, disgusting as they were, horrifying as they were, had kept her alive. Greta's eyes opened. Just barely. Just enough for Elliot to see that they were blue, the pale blue of winter ice. And in those eyes, he saw terror. Not of the pain, not of the wound, but of him. She tried to pull away, to curl into herself, to protect herself from what she clearly believed was coming. Her lips moved, forming words in German that came out as barely a whisper. "Nicht anfassen. Ich bin schmutzig. Don't touch me. I'm filthy." Elliot moved closer slowly, his hands visible, his posture as non-threatening as he could make it. He answered in German, in the warm, familiar dialect his grandmother had taught him. "I'm here to help you. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." But when she heard the German, when she processed what it meant, her terror doubled. Her breathing accelerated to hyperventilation, her whole body started to shake. Because now she understood. She could see his features, the dark, curly hair, the shape of his nose, the way he held himself. She'd been trained to recognize these things, trained to see the enemy in certain faces, certain shapes, certain ways of being. And lying there on that examination table, helpless and rotting, she was face to face with what she'd been taught to fear most. A Jew was standing over her, and she was completely at his mercy. "Bitte," she whispered. "Bitte, töte mich schnell. Please, please kill me quickly." Something broke in Elliot's chest. Something he'd kept carefully sealed since the newsreels from the camps started coming back, since he'd learned that his grandmother's cousins, all of them, every single one, had been erased from the earth as if they'd never existed. He looked at this girl, this child really wasted down to nothing, rotting alive, begging him for a quick death, and he made a decision. "I'm not going to kill you," he said quietly in German. "I'm going to save your life, whether you want me to or not." He turned to the guard, who was still standing, still swaying, still pale. "Get Dr. Hardy, now, and tell Nurse Walsh I need her. Then find me morphine plasma and the surgical kit. Move." The guard stumbled toward the door, grateful to have something to do, somewhere else to be. Elliot turned back to Greta. Her eyes had closed again, but tears were running down her temples into her matted hair. She was trembling continuously now, shock setting in fully. Elliot grabbed a wool blanket from the supply cabinet and laid it carefully over her, avoiding the wound. The June heat made the blanket almost cruel, but shock could kill as surely as infection, and her body temperature was too low. He moved to the head of the table, positioning himself where she could see him without turning her head. "Listen to me," he said in German, keeping his voice low and steady. "My name is Elliot. I'm a medic. That wound has been trying to kill you for almost 3 weeks. The only reason you're still alive is because you're stronger than you know, and because those maggots, horrible as they are, have been eating the dead tissue, keeping the infection localized. They saved your life." He paused, watching her process this. Her eyes opened again, searching his face. "I'm going to remove them. I'm going to clean the wound, and then I'm going to do surgery to remove the dead tissue and close what I can close. It's going to hurt. Even with morphine, it's going to hurt. But you're going to live. Do you understand me? You're going to live." "Warum?" she whispered. "Why?" "Because that's what I do," Elliot said. "I save lives. I don't care what uniform you were wearing. I don't care what side you were on. You're 19 years old and you're hurt and you need help. That's enough." He heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, deliberate footsteps that he recognized. Dr. Vincent Hardy, the chief medical officer of Camp Concordia. 42 years old, from a ranch outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. A man who'd lost his only son at Normandy on D-Day +3. A man who carried that loss in every line of his weathered face. Hardy walked into the examination room and stopped. Even from across the room, even with his decades of medical experience, Elliot saw him recoil. The smell had filled the entire space now, thick and cloying, impossible to escape. Hardy's jaw tightened. He approached the table, slowly looked down at Greta, at the wound, at the maggots still crawling through dead flesh. "Jesus Christ," he said softly. Then to Elliot. "How long has she had this?" "I'd estimate 19 to 21 days, sir. Shrapnel wound, likely from an explosion. She's self-treated with improvised bandages and a tourniquet. The maggots are blowfly larvae, probably about a week old, feeding on necrotic tissue." Hardy leaned closer, his experienced eyes cataloguing the damage. Elliot saw his expression harden, saw the shutters come down. When Hardy straightened up, his face was set in stone. "She's septic," Hardy said flatly. "Look at the tissue margins. The infection has spread beyond the wound bed. She's got maybe 12 hours, probably less." The maggots bought her time, but not enough. "Even if we operate, even if we throw everything we have at this, the odds are she doesn't make it off the table." "We have to try," Elliot said. "No," Hardy said, and there was something cold and final in his voice. "No, we don't. This is a prisoner of war, an enemy combatant. We have limited supplies, limited blood plasma, limited morphine. And we have wards full of American soldiers who need those supplies, men who fought for their country, men who deserve our best efforts. Not her." Elliot felt something ignite in his chest. something he'd been carrying since the war started, since the letters stopped coming from the old country, since he'd learned what the camps really were. "Sir, she's 19. I don't care if she's 12. Hardy cut him off. "My son was 19 when he died on Omaha Beach. 19 years old, cut in half by German machine gun fire. German. Do you understand what I'm saying, Brennan? She's the enemy. She wore their uniform. She fought for them. She probably killed American boys. Maybe she killed my son. I don't know and I don't care. I'm not wasting morphine on a dying German girl when I have Americans who need it." The room went silent. Elliot could hear Greta's breathing fast and shallow, could hear the distant sounds of the camp outside the normal rhythms of a June morning in Kansas, could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "She tied a tourniquet around herself," Elliot said quietly. "She survived 19 days with this wound. She crossed the Atlantic on a transport ship with no medical care. She has a will to live that's stronger than anything I've seen in 2 years of this war. That has to count for something." Hardy's face softened just for a moment, just long enough for Elliot to see the grief underneath the anger, the father under the doctor. But then the stone came back. "It counts for nothing," Hardy said. "Let nature take its course. Make her comfortable if you want. But I'm not authorizing surgery, and I'm not wasting resources. That's final." He turned to leave, and Elliot made a decision that would change the course of his life. "Then I'll do it myself," he said. Hardy stopped, turned back slowly. "What did you say?" "I said I'll do it myself, without your authorization, without your help. I'll use my own time supplies that would expire anyway, and I'll take full responsibility. Court-martial me if you want. But I'm not letting her die because we decided her life wasn't worth saving." For a long moment, Hardy just stared at him. Elliot could see the calculation happening behind those eyes, the weighing of regulations against conscience of military protocol, against medical ethics of personal grief, against professional duty. Nurse Margaret Walsh appeared in the doorway, a slight woman in her late 20s with red hair pinned back severely under her cap. She took one look at the scene, at the woman on the table, at the two men facing each other, and her expression shifted from routine to alert. "Sir," she said to Hardy, "what do you need?" Hardy didn't answer immediately. He looked at Elliot, at Greta, at the wound that was slowly killing her, and Elliot saw something shift in his face, saw some internal battle reach a conclusion. "Doctor," Margaret said again, more gently this time, "she's somebody's daughter." Something in those words landed. Hardy's shoulders dropped just slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "She's 19 years old, you said?" "Yes, sir," Elliot replied. "My daughter was 18 when she died in childbirth," Hardy said quietly. 1940, 5 years ago this month. I see her face every time I close my eyes." He moved to the examination table, looked down at Greta. Really looked at her beyond the uniform, beyond the nationality, beyond everything except the human being lying there. When he looked up at Elliot, his eyes were bright. "I won't help you," he said. "I can't. I have a responsibility to the American soldiers in my care, and I won't compromise that. But I won't stop you either. You and Walsh, you own this. If she dies on that table, it's on you. If you use supplies that other men need, it's on you. If you spend hours on a lost cause while Americans suffer, it's on you. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Elliot said. "I understand." "No," Hardy said, his voice hardening again. "I don't think you do, but you will." He walked out, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Margaret moved to the table immediately, her assessment quick and professional. She looked at the wound, at the maggots, at Greta's pale face. Then she looked at Elliot. "We'll need to collect the maggots first," she said calmly, as if they were discussing something routine. "They've done their job. Time to let modern medicine take over. I'll get the jars. You start the IV line and get morphine into her. We're going to need at least 4 hours for this, probably more." "Margaret," Elliot said, "you don't have to—" "Yes," she interrupted. "I do. I'm from a farm in Kansas. We had a saying, You don't let anything die if there's a chance to save it. Doesn't matter if it's a calf or a coyote or a German girl with maggots in her back. You save what you can save. That's the job. She left to get supplies. Elliot turned back to Greta, who had been watching this entire exchange with those pale blue eyes, understanding enough of the English to know her fate was being decided. "We're going to operate," he told her in German. "It's going to be bad, but you're going to live. That's a promise." Greta's lips moved. "Ich verdiene das nicht." "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," Elliot said, starting to set up the IV line. "Maybe none of us deserve anything. But here we are anyway, so let's see if we can get you through to tomorrow." He found a vein in her arm, paper-thin and collapsing, but good enough. Got the needle in on the first try, started saline flowing. Her skin was cool to the touch, clammy the texture of wax. He drew up morphine more than he probably should give someone her size, but pain control was going to be critical. "This is going to make the pain better," he said, injecting it slowly into the IV line. "You're going to feel strange, disconnected, but I'll be here the whole time. I won't leave you." The morphine hit her system within seconds. Her eyes went unfocused, her breathing deepened slightly. But she didn't lose consciousness. She was too far gone for that, her body too stressed, her system too overwhelmed. The drug just took the edge off, gave her some distance from the agony that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks. Margaret returned with Jar's forceps and the surgical kit. Also a mask soaked in peppermint oil, which she tied over her nose and mouth. She handed one to Elliot, and he did the same. The peppermint helped, but not much. Some smells were too powerful to mask. "I'll remove the maggots and collect them," Margaret said. "You start debriding from the edges, work your way in. We'll meet in the middle. Standard necrotic tissue removal protocol, but worse than usual." They worked in silence for the first hour. Elliot cutting away dead flesh with a scalpel, Margaret using forceps to carefully remove each maggot and place it in a jar. There were hundreds of them. Some were still embedded deep in the necrotic tissue, having burrowed in to feed. Each one had to be removed carefully, completely, because leaving even one could cause complications later. Greta drifted in and out of morphine consciousness. Sometimes she would tense her hands, gripping the edges of the examination table so hard her knuckles went white. Sometimes she would make small sounds, not quite words, just expressions of pain that went beyond language. And sometimes she would speak fragments of German that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. "Das U-Boot sinkt," she murmured at one point. "Wasser überall. So kalt." The submarine is sinking. Water everywhere. So cold. Elliot and Margaret exchanged glances over their masks. A submarine. That explained how she'd gotten from Europe to America, how she'd acquired this wound and somehow survived long enough to end up in Kansas. A U-boat probably sunk in the Atlantic. Probably by American destroyers. She'd survived the sinking, survived the Atlantic, survived with this wound festering inside her. The will to live that represented was staggering. 2 hours in, Elliot hit bone. The shrapnel had gone deep, had fractured her lower ribs on the right side. He could see the damage now, could trace the path the metal had taken through her body. It had missed the kidney by less than an inch. Had nicked the bowel, causing the infection. Had carved a channel through muscle and fat and skin that should have killed her in days. Should have, but hadn't. "I need to extend the incision," he told Margaret. "I have to get to the source of the infection, make sure there's no retained foreign body." Margaret nodded, already preparing more instruments. Elliot made the cut, extending the wound another 4 inches, going deeper. Blood welled up, not the bright red of healthy tissue, but the dark, sluggish blood of infection. He packed it with gauze, worked his way deeper, his fingers slippery with body fluids and pus. There, deep in the muscle embedded against the rib, a piece of shrapnel the size of his thumbnail. Jagged, irregular, covered in rust and dried blood. He worked it free carefully, feeling the metal grind against bone. Greta's whole body went rigid, a low moan escaping her lips despite the morphine. Margaret held her shoulders, keeping her as still as possible. The shrapnel came free. Elliot held it up to the light, this small piece of metal that had nearly killed her. He set it aside in a specimen jar, another piece of evidence in the incomprehensible violence of war. "Got it," he said. "Now we clean." They irrigated the wound with liters of saline, flushing out debris and bacteria and the remnants of infection. They debrided more tissue, cutting away anything that looked questionable, anything that might harbor infection. They worked with the focused intensity of sculptors carving away death to reveal life underneath. 3 hours in, Margaret had to step away, her hands shaking from fatigue. Elliot kept going, his back screaming, his eyes burning, his hands steady despite everything. Because stopping meant giving up. And he'd promised. He'd promised this girl she would live. 4 hours in, they started closing, layer by layer, tissue by tissue, pulling together what could be pulled together, packing with sulfur powder what couldn't. 73 stitches, internal and external, each one placed with care that bordered on obsessive, because this wound had to heal. Had to. He wouldn't accept any other outcome. At hour 4 and 20 minutes, Elliot placed the final stitch, tied it off, stepped back from the table, his hands finally starting to shake now that the work was done. Margaret was already applying the dressing, clean white gauze and tape covering the obscenity of what they'd just done with the civilized pretense of proper medical care. Greta was still breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady. Her color was bad, the pallor of shock and blood loss, but she was alive. Against all odds, against Hardy's prediction, against everything reasonable and logical, she was alive. Margaret checked the IV, adjusted the drip rate. "She needs blood," she said quietly. "She's lost so much, but we don't have her type, and I'm not authorized to requisition from the American stores." "Use mine," Elliot said immediately. "I'm O negative. Universal donor. Take what you need." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "That's against protocol. You can't donate to enemy prisoners." "Then don't tell anyone," Elliot said. "Court-martial me for that too if it comes to it. But she needs blood, and I have blood. It's that simple." 20 minutes later, Elliot was lying on a cot next to the examination table, his blood flowing through a tube into Greta's veins. A direct transfusion, old-fashioned and risky, but faster than collecting and storing. Margaret monitored both of them, checking pulses and pressures, making sure neither of them crashed. Elliot felt the blood leave his body, felt the strange, light-headed sensation of donation, and watched Greta's face for signs of improvement. It took time. But gradually, so gradually, he almost missed it. Some color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened. Her pulse strengthened. At 2:30 in the morning, 6 hours after they'd started, Margaret finally disconnected the transfusion line. Elliot sat up slowly, the world spinning briefly before settling. Margaret handed him orange juice and made him drink the whole glass before she'd let him stand. "She's stable," Margaret said, and there was wonder in her voice. "Against all odds, against everything, she's stable. Pulse is 54, blood pressure is 78/52. Not great, but survivable. The infection is controlled, the wound is closed, and she's breathing on her own. Elliot, I think she's going to make it." Elliot moved to the head of the examination table, looked down at Greta's sleeping face. The morphine had finally pulled her under completely, giving her the first real rest she'd had in 3 weeks. In sleep, with the pain and fear erased, he could see how young she really was. 19. Just a girl. Just a human being who'd been caught up in something vast and incomprehensible and had somehow survived. "Get some rest," Margaret said quietly. "I'll watch her. You've done enough." But Elliot pulled up a stool and sat down next to the table. "I'll stay," he said. "Just for a while. I want to make sure she's really going to be okay." Margaret didn't argue. She left to file paperwork to document what they'd done in careful medical language that wouldn't reveal too much. Elliot sat in the quiet recovery room, listening to Greta breathe, listening to his own heartbeat return to normal, listening to the camp wake up outside as dawn approached. At 4 in the morning, as the first grey light filtered through the windows, Greta's eyes opened. Just barely, just enough to see. She looked at Elliot sitting beside her, at the bandages on her back, at the IV still running into her arm. Her lips moved, forming words in German that came out as barely a whisper. "Du hast mich wirklich gerettet. You really saved me." "Yes," Elliot said in German. "I really did." "Warum?" Why? It was the same question she'd asked before. But now, after 6 hours of surgery, after giving his own blood, after defying his commanding officer and risking everything, Elliot had a better answer. "Because 6 million of my people are dead," he said quietly. 6 million Jews murdered because someone decided their lives weren't worth saving, because someone decided they were less than human. And I look at you dying on this table and I think not one more, not if I can help it, not one more death that I could have prevented. That's why. Greta stared at him, her morphine-clouded mind trying to process this. Tears formed in her eyes, ran down her temples into her hair. "I was taught," she whispered, "I was taught that Jews were monsters, Untermenschen. I believed it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "I know," Elliot said. He reached out, took her hand. It was cool and fragile, like holding a bird. "But you're not dead. And that means you can learn something different. You can choose to be something different. That's what being alive means. You get to choose." "What did you find?" she asked, her words slurring as the morphine pulled her back under. "When you touched my wound, what did you find?" Elliot thought about the maggots, about the necrotic tissue, about the shrapnel embedded in bone, about the infection that should have killed her, about the will to live that had kept her breathing through 19 days of agony. He thought about what it meant to touch someone's wound, to see them at their most vulnerable, their most broken, and choose to heal rather than turn away. "I found someone worth saving," he said simply. Greta's eyes closed. Her breathing deepened into real sleep, the kind of sleep that heals. Her hand stayed in Elliot's, and he sat there as dawn broke fully over Kansas, as the camp came alive with the sounds of another day, as the impossible fact of what they'd done settled into reality. She was alive. Against Hardy's prediction, against the odds, against everything reasonable, she was alive. And Elliot Brennan, a Jewish medic from Nebraska, had touched the wound that everyone else feared, had reached into the rot and the horror and pulled out something worth saving. That was the victory, not the war, not the medals, not the glory of battle or the triumph of nations. Just this. One life saved. One person given a second chance. One moment where mercy won over hate. He sat with her as the morning light grew stronger, as the heat of another Kansas day began to build, and knew that whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from his choice, this moment was worth it. This was what he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. Not the smell of decay or the sight of maggots, but this, the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her hand in his, the simple, profound fact that she was alive, and that he had chosen to make it so. The first time she tasted real butter, she cried for 20 minutes. Day 1 after surgery, June 23rd, 1945. Greta woke to pain that felt different from before. Not the deep, poisonous ache of infection eating through her body. This was surgical pain, clean pain, the kind that meant healing, not dying. She opened her eyes to find Elliot Brennan sitting in the same chair he'd occupied all night. His eyes bloodshot, his uniform wrinkled, but his expression alert. When he saw her awake, he stood immediately, checked her pulse, her temperature, the dressing on her back. His hands were gentle, professional, but Greta flinched anyway. Not from pain, from disbelief. A Jew was touching her, caring for her, had spent the night watching over her. Everything she'd been taught said this was impossible. Jews were cruel, heartless, inhuman. The propaganda films had shown it. The Hitler Youth leaders had drilled it into her. Jews existed only to destroy Germany, to corrupt and pollute and destroy. But here was Elliot adjusting her IV, with careful precision, speaking to her in soft German, asking if she needed more morphine. Here was the contradiction between what she'd been taught and what she was experiencing. And that contradiction hurt worse than the wound. "How do you feel?" he asked in German. Greta tried to answer, but her throat was too dry. Elliot held a cup of water to her lips, supported her head while she drank. The water was cool, clean, tasted like nothing and everything. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was until that moment. "Hurt," she finally managed in German. "But different." "That's good," Elliot said. "That means the infection is under control. Your body can focus on healing now instead of fighting poison." He paused, then added quietly, "You're going to live, Greta. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you're going to live." She wanted to ask why again. Why he'd saved her. Why he'd given his own blood. Why he was sitting here after working through the night when he could be sleeping. But the morphine was pulling at her, making words too difficult, making thought too slow. She drifted back under, and when she woke again, it was afternoon. This time, Nurse Margaret Walsh was there. The red-haired woman checked Greta's vitals with efficient care, changed the dressing with hands that were firm but not cruel. Greta watched her face for signs of hatred or disgust, but found only concentration. Professional detachment, the same expression she might wear treating anyone. "Can you understand English?" Margaret asked. Greta nodded slightly. She'd learned some English in school before the war, though speaking it was harder than understanding. "Good," Margaret said, "because I'm going to be blunt with you. You survived something that should have killed you 3 times over. That wound was infected down to the bone. The maggots kept you alive, but barely. Elliot gave you his own blood last night. O negative. Universal donor. He gave until he was lightheaded and pale, and then he sat up all night watching you breathe. I don't know what you did in the war. I don't know what side you fought for or what you believed. But you're alive now because a Jewish man decided your life was worth his blood. I suggest you think about that." She left before Greta could respond. Left her alone with thoughts that circled like vultures. A Jew gave me his blood. His blood is in my veins now, flowing through my heart, keeping me alive. The thought was so foreign, so incomprehensible that Greta's mind kept trying to reject it. But her body knew the truth. She could feel the strength returning slowly, could feel her heart beating stronger. Jewish blood keeping a German girl alive. What did that make her now? Day 2. June 24th. Elliot brought food, broth thin and pale, barely more than flavoured water. But to Greta, who hadn't eaten real food in weeks, it was overwhelming. The warmth of it, the salt, the faint taste of chicken. She managed 3 spoonfuls before her stomach rebelled and she had to stop. But Elliot smiled anyway, said 3 spoonfuls was progress, said tomorrow she'd manage 4. He stayed while she ate or tried to eat, talking to her in German about nothing important. The weather, the wheat fields outside the camp, his grandmother's farm in Nebraska. Safe topics. Easy topics. Things that didn't require her to think about who she was or what she'd done or why she was alive. But Greta couldn't stop thinking about it. "You're Jewish," she said suddenly, interrupting his story about harvest season. Elliot stopped talking, looked at her directly. "Yes, I am." "I was taught," she began, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell him that she'd been taught to see him as less than human, as vermin, as the enemy of everything good? How could she say that out loud to the man who'd saved her life? "I know what you were taught," Elliot said quietly. "I've seen the propaganda. I've heard the speeches. I know what they told you about my people." He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "But here I am, human, flawed, tired, just trying to do my job, just trying to save lives. Does that match what you were taught?" Greta felt tears burning in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Nothing matches." "Good," Elliot said. "That means you're thinking. That means you're questioning. That's the first step to becoming someone different than who you were." He left her, then had other patients to see, other duties to perform, but his words stayed with her, circling through her morphine-clouded mind. Someone different than who you were. Was that possible? Could a person change that fundamentally? Could she stop being the girl who'd believed the lies and become someone else? Day 3. The fever came back. Not as bad as before, but bad enough. Greta's temperature spiked to 103, her body shaking with chills despite the Kansas heat. Elliot was there immediately checking the wound, looking for signs that the infection had returned. But the wound looked clean pink tissue beginning to form at the edges. This was just her body's response to trauma, to surgery, to the massive assault it had endured. He gave her more morphine, more fluids through the IV, wrapped her in blankets despite her protests that she was burning, and he stayed. Through the afternoon, through the evening, through the long night when the fever peaked and Greta hallucinated her mother's face, her father's voice, the fire that had consumed her flak battery. In her delirium, she spoke without filter. Told Elliot things she'd never told anyone. About her father, the shopkeeper who'd tried to protect the Jewish family next door during Kristallnacht. How the brown shirts had beaten him in the street. How he'd died 3 days later from internal bleeding. How she'd been 12 years old and hadn't understood. About her mother forced into factory work, killed in an Allied bombing raid in 1944. About joining the Hitler Youth at 14, because everyone did, because refusing meant suspicion, meant danger, meant being alone. About the propaganda films they'd shown, the Jews as rats, as parasites, as inhuman things that needed to be eliminated. About how she'd believed it because everyone around her believed it, because questioning meant exile, because she'd been 14 and scared and alone and desperate to belong to something. About volunteering for the flak battery at 17. About learning to operate the anti-aircraft guns. About shooting at American bombers, seeing them fall from the sky in flames, knowing that men were dying, but telling herself they were the enemy. They deserved it. They were coming to destroy Germany. About the night her battery was overrun. The explosion that had torn through her back. The 14 other girls who'd died screaming while she'd played dead under their bodies. The 3 days hiding in rubble before American soldiers found her. The shame of being captured. The certainty that she deserved to die. Elliot listened to all of it. Didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just sat there bathing her forehead with cool water and listening to the confessions of a fevered girl who'd been taught to hate him. When the fever finally broke on day 4, the June 26th, Greta woke to find him still there. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn with exhaustion, but he was there. And the first thing she said in halting English was, "I'm sorry." Elliot shook his head. Don't apologize for being lied to. Apologize for what you do now that you know the truth. That's what matters. Day 5, June 27th. Greta could sit up for short periods, could take small sips of water without help, could eat half a bowl of broth. Progress, Margaret called it. Miraculous progress for someone who'd been 68 pounds of rot and infection less than a week ago. But it was also the day Sergeant Vernon Polk came to see her. Vernon was the camp cook. A black man from Tennessee, 42 years old, with hands scarred from decades of kitchen work and eyes that had seen more than most. He came into the recovery room carrying a covered tray, nodded to Elliot, and set the tray on the bedside table. "Heard you've been living on broth," Vernon said in English. Elliot translated to German for Greta. "Figured it was time for real food, if you can handle it." He uncovered the tray, and Greta's world stopped. 5 strips of bacon, thick cut, perfectly cooked, the edges curled and crispy, the centers still tender. 2 eggs fried sunny side up, the yolks bright orange and quivering. 2 slices of white bread, toasted golden, spread thick with real butter that was already melting into the bread, and a glass of whole milk so white it almost hurt to look at. The smell hit her first. Salt and smoke and caramelizing fat. The smell of meat cooking, of protein and richness and abundance. Greta hadn't smelled real bacon since 1942. 3 years. She'd been 16 the last time she'd eaten bacon at her grandmother's house before the rationing got bad, before the war took everything. She stared at the tray, unable to process what she was seeing. This much food. This much real, abundant, excessive food. For her. For a German prisoner. For someone who deserved nothing. "Can't rebuild a body on broth alone," Vernon said through Elliot's translation. "You need protein, fat, real nutrition. So eat. Don't insult my cooking by refusing." He left before she could respond. Elliot helped her sit up, more fully arranged pillows behind her back, moved the tray closer. Greta just stared at it, her hands trembling. "I can't," she whispered in German. "Why not?" Elliot asked. "My mother," Greta said, and her voice broke. "My mother ate sawdust bread. The factories, they gave workers bread made with sawdust because there wasn't enough flour. She ate that for 2 years, and then she died. She died eating sawdust while I ate military rations. Not good rations, but real food, real bread. And now there's bacon. Real bacon. 5 pieces. And she's dead." Elliot was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother ate sawdust so you could eat bread. She sacrificed so you could live. And now she's gone, and you survived, and you have a choice. You can refuse this food, starve yourself out of guilt, and waste her sacrifice. Or you can eat. You can live. You can honor her by choosing to survive. What do you think she would want?" Greta closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, saw her mother's face, heard her voice from a memory from before the war, from when Greta was small. "Iss, Liebling, iss und werde stark. Eat, darling, eat and grow strong." She opened her eyes, looked at the bacon, at the impossible abundance of it, at the evidence of American wealth so vast they could give 5 strips of bacon to a dying German girl without thinking twice about it. Elliot cut a small piece of bacon with a fork, held it up. "Try 1 bite, just 1. If you can't do more, that's okay, but try." Greta took the fork with shaking hands, raised it to her mouth. The bacon was still warm, the fat glistening. She put it in her mouth and bit down. The crispy exterior shattered between her teeth, then melted instantly into pure richness. Salt exploded across her tongue, then the smoke flavor deep and complex. The fat coated her mouth, her throat like warm silk sliding down. There was a subtle sweetness at the Finnish maple, maybe, or just the natural sugars in the pork caramelizing. It was the most intense thing Greta had ever tasted. After months of nothing, after weeks of starvation, after days of broth, this single bite of bacon was overwhelming. Every nerve in her mouth lit up, every sense screamed, "This is food. This is real. This is life." She chewed, slowly, swallowed, felt the warmth of it settle into her empty stomach. And then she started crying. Not quiet tears, sobbing. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body and tore at her stitches and hurt. But she couldn't stop. Because her mother was dead and would never taste bacon again. Because she was alive eating bacon in an American prison camp while Germans starved in the ruins of Hamburg. Because a Jew had given her his blood and a black man had cooked her the best breakfast she'd ever seen, and none of it made sense with anything she'd been taught about the world. Because the bacon tasted like peace, like abundance, like a future she hadn't known was possible, and she didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve any of it. Elliot didn't try to stop her crying, just sat there, hand on her shoulder, letting her break. Margaret came in, assessed the situation, and quietly left. Vernon returned to check on his cooking, saw Greta crying, and nodded once to Elliot before leaving again. They understood. Both of them. They'd seen enough in this war to understand what it meant when someone finally broke under the weight of surviving. When Greta could finally breathe again, when the sobs had subsided to hiccups, she looked at Elliot with red, swollen eyes. "I don't understand," she said in German. "Why are you kind? I was taught you would torture prisoners, that you were cruel and heartless, but you give blood and food and kindness. Why?" Elliot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because cruelty is easy, kindness is hard, and I choose hard. Every day I choose hard, because the alternative is becoming what they said we were. The alternative is proving the hate was justified, and I won't do that. I won't let them win by making me into a monster." He picked up another piece of bacon, cut it into smaller pieces. "Now eat, all of it. Because your mother would want you to. Because living is the best revenge against everyone who wanted you dead. Because you're 19 years old and you have a whole life ahead of you if you choose to take it. Eat." Greta ate. slowly through tears, through guilt, through the overwhelming sensation of taste after deprivation. She ate one strip of bacon, then another. The eggs with their rich yolks that coated the tongue like cream. The toast where butter had melted into every pore of the bread. She drank the milk cold and sweet and impossibly white. She ate until her stomach hurt, until she couldn't take another bite, until she'd consumed more calories in one meal than she'd had in a week on the U-boat. And then, for the first time since the surgery, she fell asleep without morphine. Just exhaustion and fullness and the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. When she woke, it was evening. The tray was gone. Elliot was back in his chair reading a book by lamplight. Greta watched him for a while, this Jewish man who'd saved her, trying to reconcile everything she'd been taught with everything she'd experienced. "Elliot," she said quietly in English, using his name for the first time. He looked up, marked his place in the book, set it aside. "Yes." "The bacon," she said, struggling with the English words. "It tastes like hope. Is that right word?" Elliot smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly the right word." That night, for the first time in 3 years, Greta dreamed of something other than fire and death. She dreamed of a kitchen with sunlight streaming through windows, of her mother making breakfast humming while she cooked, of bacon sizzling in a pan and the smell filling the house, of being small and safe and loved. When she woke, she knew her mother was gone, knew she could never go back to who she'd been. But she also knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to live. Not out of fear, not out of habit, but because she'd tasted hope. And hope, it turned out, tasted like bacon. Week 2, early July. Margaret was changing Greta's bandages when she noticed something unusual in the corner of the recovery room. Greta's tattered uniform bundled for disposal. Something metallic glinted from one of the pockets. Margaret reached in and pulled out a small enamel pin. The design was unmistakable. The Jung Mädel badge. Hitler Youth. The swastika and diamond shape that marked membership in the Nazi girls' organization. She held it up to the light, her face unreadable. Then she looked at Greta, who had gone very still. "This was in your pocket," Margaret said quietly. Greta's eyes filled with tears. "I was 14, she whispered in English. Everyone wore it. If you didn't..." She couldn't finish. Margaret set the badge on the table between them. "You know what happens if the camp commander finds Nazi symbols? Possession is punishable. Solitary confinement, loss of privileges." "I understand," Greta said, her voice breaking. "I deserve..." The door opened. Elliot walked in for his afternoon check-in, saw the badge, saw Margaret's expression, saw Greta crying. He understood immediately. He picked up the badge, looked at it. This small piece of metal that represented everything his people had suffered under. Everything that had tried to destroy them. Everything that had poisoned this girl's mind. "May I?" he asked Margaret. She nodded. Elliot walked to the recovery room's small coal stove used for sterilizing instruments. Opened the grate. The coals inside glowed orange-red. He held the badge over the opening, let Greta see it one last time. "The girl who wore this is dead," he said in German. "She died on that examination table. What's alive now is someone different, someone who gets to choose who she becomes." He dropped the badge into the coals. They watched it together as the enamel bubbled and blackened, as the metal warped and melted, as the swastika disappeared into ash. "You're free of it now," Elliot said. "All of it." Greta pressed her hand over the hidden place where soon Elliot would give her a different symbol, one that would mean mercy instead of hate, one that would remind her that people could choose kindness over cruelty even when the world said otherwise. Margaret witnessed all of this in silence. Later in her report she would write, "Patient's personal effects disposed of per camp regulations, no violations noted." She never mentioned the badge, never reported what Elliot had done. Some acts of mercy required conspiracy. Over the next 2 weeks, Greta's body rebuilt itself slowly. Her weight climbed from 68 pounds to 89, then to 103. The wound on her back healed clean pink tissue filling in from the edges, the maggot's inadvertent gift becoming a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. She learned to walk again, supported first by Margaret's arm, then by a cane, then on her own 2 feet. And every day Elliot came, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He brought things: an English-German dictionary, a worn copy of Reader's Digest, a pencil and paper so she could write if speaking was too difficult. They talked about small things: the weather, the wheat harvest happening in the fields beyond the camp fence, his grandmother's farm in Nebraska, and how the wheat there would be tall now, ready for cutting. Greta asked questions about Judaism, tentative at first, expecting offense, but Elliot answered patiently, explained the Sabbath, the prayers his grandmother had taught him, the traditions his family had tried to maintain even as they assimilated into American life. It was nothing like the propaganda films, nothing like the caricatures she'd been shown, just people, just faith, just humans trying to make sense of the world through ritual and community. "I believed such terrible things," she said one afternoon in halting English. She was practicing more, trying to learn, trying to become something other than the girl who'd operated flak guns. "About your people. I believed you were not human. Monsters." Elliot looked at her steadily. "And now I think maybe I was the monster," Greta said quietly. "I shot at planes, American planes. Boys died because of me. I know they did. And I told myself it was right. It was necessary. We were defending the fatherland. But those boys had mothers, fathers, families who loved them. And they're dead because I pointed a gun at the sky and fired." "You were 17, Elliot said. 17 years old, raised in a system that weaponized children. That doesn't erase what you did. But it means you have a choice now. You can carry that guilt forever, let it destroy you, or you can decide to be different, to build instead of destroy, to heal instead of hurt. That's all redemption is, choosing differently." Greta traced patterns on the blanket covering her legs. "How do I choose differently when I'm a prisoner, when I have no power?" "You're alive," Elliot said simply. "That's power. You survived when you shouldn't have. That means something. It has to mean something. Make it mean you'll go home someday and build a life that honors the people who didn't survive. All of them. On both sides. That's how you choose differently." Week 3, July 14th. Greta wrote a letter to Elliot in broken English. Worked on it for 3 days, using the dictionary he'd brought, checking and rechecking every word. She gave it to him folded into a small square, her hands shaking. He read it there in the recovery room while she watched, terrified of his reaction. "Mr. Brennan," it began, formal and stilted. "You touch my wound. You not afraid of rot. You not hate me, even I give you reason for hate. You are Jew, I am Nazi. This should mean you hurt me, but you save me instead. Why, I think I understand now. You choose to heal because someone must. Someone must say no more hate, no more killing. I was taught wrong things about Jews, about humanity, about what it means to be human. You show me truth. You give blood, give food, give kindness I do not deserve. I do not have words to say thank you enough. In German or English there are not enough words, but I say anyway. Thank you. Thank you for my life. I will not waste it. I promise you this. The girl who believed lies is dead. I am someone new now, someone you helped make. Thank you. Greta." Elliot folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his uniform pocket over his heart. His eyes were bright. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice rough. "Whatever happens next, you're going to be okay." But that same afternoon, everything changed. Corporal Blake Turner had been watching. For 3 weeks he'd been watching Elliot Brennan spend every spare moment with the German prisoner, watching the way Elliot looked at her, the softness in his voice when he spoke German, the time he invested, the care he took, the obvious attachment that had formed. Turner, whose brother had died at the Battle of the Bulge, whose hatred of Germans was a living thing inside him, made a decision. He waited until Elliot was on duty elsewhere. Then he went to Elliot's footlocker in the barracks, pried it open with a screwdriver, and found Greta's letter. Read it. Saw the intimacy in the words, the familiarity. And he saw an opportunity. Turner spent that evening crafting his own letter. Wrote it in deliberately broken English imitating Greta's style from the letter he'd found. Made it romantic, inappropriate, full of implications that crossed every line of military protocol. Signed it with Greta's name, and the next morning, July 15th, he delivered it to Colonel Francis Morrison, the camp commander. Morrison read the fake letter with a face like stone, called Elliot to his office an hour later, showed him the letter, watched Elliot's face pale as he read words he'd never seen before, words Greta had never written. "This isn't real," Elliot said immediately. "Sir, this isn't her handwriting. Someone forged this." "Maybe," Morrison said. "Or maybe a lonely medic has been spending too much time with a pretty German prisoner. Either way, it's a problem. You've logged over 120 hours with prisoner Hoffman. You've used camp resources for her care. You've been seen giving her special treatment. And now there's this." He tapped the letter. "Real or not, it creates the appearance of impropriety. Fraternization with enemy prisoners is a court-martial offense, Brennan. You know that." "I saved her life," Elliot said, fighting to keep his voice level. "I'm monitoring her recovery. That's standard medical protocol, sir." "Standard is 8 to 10 check-ins over 2 weeks, Morrison said. "You've been there every day, multiple times a day. You gave her a blood transfusion from your own veins, Brennan. That's not standard. That's personal." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm ordering you confined to barracks pending a court-martial hearing. July 25th, 10 days. You're to have no contact with prisoner Hoffman during this time. Understood?" "Sir, she still needs medical monitoring. Nurse Walsh can handle it." Morrison cut him off. "You're dismissed. Confined to barracks as of now." Elliot stood, saluted, mechanically turned to leave. At the door, Morrison's voice stopped him. "For what it's worth, Brennan, I believe you. I think someone set you up. But I have to follow protocol. The hearing will determine the truth. Until then, stay away from her." "That's an order." Greta learned about the court-martial from Margaret that evening. The nurse tried to explain gently, but there was no gentle way to say it. Elliot had been accused of inappropriate conduct. With her. Because of time he'd spent saving her life. He faced dishonorable discharge, possible prison time at Leavenworth, because he'd chosen to let her live. Greta's first reaction was rage. At herself, at the system, at the unfairness of punishing Mercy. Her second reaction was determination. She demanded to see Colonel Morrison, demanded to testify, demanded to tell them the truth. That Elliot had been nothing but professional. That she'd written him one letter, just one, expressing gratitude. That whatever other letter they had was a forgery, a lie. But Morrison refused to see her. POW testimony, he said, was inadmissible in cases involving American military personnel. Her word meant nothing. She was the enemy. And enemy words couldn't save an American soldier, no matter how true they were. Greta stopped eating. Day 1 without Elliot, she refused breakfast. Day 2 refused lunch and dinner. Day 3, Margaret threatened to restrain her and force-feed her if necessary. "You think starving yourself helps him," Margaret said sharply. "You think wasting his work, throwing away the life he saved, somehow makes this better. It doesn't. It makes it worse. Because if you die, if you give up, then everyone who says he wasted resources on you will be proven right. The only way you help Elliot now is by living, by getting strong, by becoming someone worth the risk he took. So eat and fight and live. That's how you repay him." Greta ate, but every bite tasted like ashes. July 25th, the court-martial hearing. Greta stood outside the administrative building where the hearing was being held as close as guards would allow. She couldn't hear what was being said inside, could only imagine, could only pray in a language she barely remembered to a God she wasn't sure existed, that somehow the truth would matter. Inside the hearing was clinical, cold. Turner testified about the letter, about Elliot's excessive time with a prisoner, about behavior unbefitting a medical officer. The fake letter was entered as evidence passed around for examination. Elliot denied writing it, denied any romantic attachment, insisted repeatedly it was forgery. Then Dr. Hardy was called to testify. Elliot had expected condemnation, expected the older doctor to confirm that he'd overstepped wasted resources, behaved inappropriately. But Hardy did something else. He stood before the panel of officers and said, "Corporal Brennan disobeyed my direct order to let prisoner Hoffman die. He performed unauthorized surgery, used camp resources without permission, and gave his own blood in a direct transfusion, all of which violated protocol." Hardy paused, let that sink in. "And I was wrong to give that order. I was wrong to let my grief, my anger at losing my son dictate medical decisions. Brennan did what I should have done. He saw a 19-year-old girl with a survivable wound, and he saved her. Because that's what doctors do. That's what healers do. We don't ask about nationality or politics or what uniform someone wore. We see suffering and we end it. That's the job. That's the oath." Hardy looked directly at Morrison at the panel of officers sitting in judgment. "If you court-martial Brennan for showing mercy, for being a better man than I was, then you're saying mercy is punishable. You're saying compassion is a crime. And if that's true, if that's what we've become, then we deserve to lose this war, because we'll have lost what we were fighting for." The room was silent when Hardy finished. He returned to his seat, sat down heavily, looked at Elliot with something that might have been respect, or might have been apology, or might have been both. Margaret testified next. Confirmed that Elliot's conduct had been professional throughout, that the surgical decisions were sound, even brilliant, that prisoner Hoffman would have died without his intervention, that the letter in evidence didn't match the handwriting sample from Greta's actual letter, the one Elliot had showed her, the one that was formal and grateful, and nothing more. The panel deliberated for 20 minutes. When they returned, Morrison read the verdict. "This panel finds insufficient evidence of fraternization. The letter in question appears to be forged, authorship unknown. Corporal Brennan's medical decisions, while unorthodox, were within the scope of his training and authority. All charges are dismissed." Elliot felt relief flood through him, weakening his knees. But Morrison wasn't finished. "However," the colonel continued, "to prevent any future allegations and to maintain the appearance of propriety, prisoner Hoffman is hereby ordered transferred to Camp Alva, Oklahoma, effective immediately. Transport will depart tomorrow morning, July 26th, at 0600 hours. This hearing is concluded." The relief turned to ice in Elliot's chest. Transfer. 900 miles away. Immediate. They were taking her away not because she'd done anything wrong, but to solve a problem. To eliminate the appearance of impropriety by eliminating proximity. It was efficient, practical, and utterly devastating. Outside, Greta saw Elliot emerge from the building, saw his face, knew before he said anything that something was wrong. Margaret came out behind him, put a hand on Greta's shoulder, and explained in simple English, "Transfer. Tomorrow. Oklahoma. Far away." Greta felt the world tilt. Not now. Not when she was finally healing, finally learning, finally becoming someone different. Not when the only person who'd ever shown her real kindness was Elliot. Not when she was just beginning to understand what it meant to be human instead of a weapon. "Can I see him?" she asked Margaret. "Please, one time, to say goodbye." Margaret looked at Morrison, who had followed them out. The colonel's face was hard, but not cruel. He considered, then nodded once. "Supervised, in the medical facility. 15 minutes, that's all." July 26th, 1945, 5 o'clock in the morning. The Kansas sky was turning grey with approaching dawn. In the camp kitchen, Vernon Polk was preparing something he'd been asked to prepare by Margaret Walsh. The same breakfast he'd made for Greta 3 weeks earlier. Bacon, eggs, toast milk. A last meal before goodbye. Margaret had arranged it, had snuck Greta into the kitchen while Elliot was finishing his overnight shift. Vernon cooked without comment, understanding without being told what this meant. The last time these two people would be in the same room. The last time the girl who'd been saved would see the man who'd saved her. Elliot came into the kitchen at 5:15, looking exhausted. Saw Greta sitting at the small table, saw the breakfast Vernon had prepared, saw Margaret standing guard by the door. He understood immediately. This was goodbye. Real goodbye. The kind that was permanent. He sat down across from Greta. Vernon set plates in front of them both. Steam rose from the bacon from the eggs. The smell filled the kitchen, that same smell that had made Greta cry 3 weeks earlier. The smell of abundance and mercy and a future she might still have. They ate in silence for a while. The food tasted different now, not because it was prepared differently, but because they both knew what it meant. A beginning and an ending. The first meal had saved her body. This meal was acknowledging that her soul had been saved too, that she'd been given a second chance at being human. "I wrote you something," Greta said finally in English. She pulled out a piece of paper folded small, worn from being carried in her pocket. "For after. For when I'm gone, and you wonder if it mattered. It mattered. You mattered. I want you to know." Elliot took the paper, but didn't unfold it. Not yet. That was for later, for when she was really gone. "You're going to go back to Germany eventually," he said. "When the war is completely over, when they repatriate prisoners. You're going to go home, and I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Greta said. "Live," Elliot said simply. "Build a life. Find a way to help people. Take everything you learned here and use it. Don't let what happened to you, what was done to you, what you did, define you forever. You get to choose who you become next. So choose well. Choose kindness. Choose healing. Promise me." "I promise," Greta said, and she meant it with everything in her. "I promise I will make your blood worth it, the blood you gave me. I will do something with this life you saved." Elliot reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandmother's Star of David necklace. Silver tarnished with age, hanging on a simple chain. He'd worn it under his uniform every day since basic training. His grandmother had given it to him the day he left for the war, made him promise to wear it to remember who he was and where he came from. "Wear this," he said, holding it out to Greta. "I know you're not Jewish, but wear it anyway, as a reminder that people are more than what they're taught, that mercy exists, that you survived when you shouldn't have, that you get to choose differently now." Greta took the necklace with trembling hands, looked at the star, this symbol she'd been taught to hate, to fear, to associate with everything evil. But all she saw now was Elliot's grandmother giving it to him with love. All she saw was the faith of a people who'd survived thousands of years of persecution and still believed in kindness. All she saw was a gift. She fastened it around her neck, tucked it under her prison uniform where it couldn't be seen. The metal was warm from being against Elliot's skin. She pressed her hand over it, feeling the shape through the fabric. "I will never take it off," she said. "Never. I swear it." Margaret glanced at the clock on the wall. 5:45. 15 minutes until the transport left. "We need to go," she said quietly. Greta stood slowly, her hand still pressed over the hidden necklace. Elliot stood too. They looked at each other across the small kitchen table, across the plates of half-eaten breakfast, across everything that had happened and everything that would never happen now. "I don't know how to thank you," Greta said, and her voice broke. "There are no words big enough." "Not in German or English. You gave me life twice, once with surgery, once by showing me I deserve to live." Elliot stepped around the table, looked at Margaret, who nodded permission. He reached out slowly, giving Greta time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't pull away. She turned, showing him her back, where the scar was still pink and new under the bandages. Elliot placed his hand over the bandaged wound. The touch was gentle, professional, but also something more. It was acknowledgement, recognition, a silent statement that he had seen her at her worst, had touched the rot and corruption, and had not been destroyed by it, had chosen to heal instead of harm. Greta placed her hand over his, pressing it firmly against her back, against the scar that would mark her for the rest of her life. "You touched the wound everyone else feared," she said in German. "That saved me. Not the surgery. This. You were not afraid. Thank you." She turned back around. Elliot pulled his dog tags from around his neck, the metal identification tags every soldier wore, held them out to Greta. "For one moment," he said, "just for a moment, to remember." Greta took the tags, the metal cool in her hands, stamped with Elliot's name, his serial number, his blood type, his religion. She pressed the cold metal to her lips, closed her eyes, and made a silent vow that she would live, that she would help people, that she would spend whatever time she had left making his choice to save her worthwhile. She handed the tags back. "Das Feuer brennt nicht mehr," she whispered in German. "The fire doesn't burn anymore." Elliot understood. The fire of hatred, of propaganda, of being hunted and afraid. It had burned out. He had helped put it out, with blood and bacon and kindness and the simple act of choosing to see her as human. "Go," he said softly. "Live. Be someone worth saving. Be someone your mother would be proud of." Margaret touched Greta's shoulder gently. Time. They had to go. Greta followed her out of the kitchen, down the hall toward the gates where the transport truck was waiting. She didn't look back. Couldn't. If she looked back, she wouldn't be able to leave. And she had to leave. Had to live. Had to prove that mercy mattered. Elliot stood alone in the kitchen. Vernon came over, put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," the older man said quietly. "That girl's alive because of you. And she's going to do something with that life, I can tell. You changed her trajectory. That's worth something." "I hope so," Elliot said. "God, I hope so." Outside, the truck engine rumbled to life. Greta climbed into the back, sat on the hard bench with 3 other prisoners being transferred. As the truck pulled away from Camp Concordia, she looked back once through the canvas cover, saw the buildings growing smaller, saw Kansas wheat fields golden in the early morning light, saw the place where she'd died and been reborn. Her hand went to her neck, to the Star of David hidden under her uniform, to the promise she'd made. The fire doesn't burn anymore, and it never would again. Elliot stood watching the dust trail from the truck until it disappeared completely. Then he went back to his barracks, to his footlocker, and pulled out the piece of paper Greta had given him. Unfolded it carefully. The English was better now, more confident. "Mr. Brennan, when I came to you, I was rotting, body and soul. You cleaned the rot from my body with your hands. You cleaned the rot from my soul with your kindness. I do not know if we have same God, but if we do, I think God put you there that day, to show me humans can be good, that I can be good too. I will go to Germany when war ends. I will go home, and I will spend my life helping people like you helped me. I will be a nurse or a teacher or something where I can touch wounds that other people fear. Because you showed me how. The fire doesn't burn anymore. Burn. Thank you for putting it out. I will remember you always. Greta Hoffman, who was dead, but is now alive." Elliot folded the letter carefully, put it in his Bible next to the blood type card that showed he was O-negative universal donor, the blood he'd given to save her life. He sat on his bunk and let himself cry just for a moment for the girl he'd saved and would never see again. But he would hear from her, every year, for 50 years. He just didn't know it yet. June 28th, 1946. A postcard arrived at Elliot's family farm in Nebraska. German postmark. No return address. Just one line written in English, the handwriting shaky but determined. "The fire doesn't burn anymore. Thank you for your touch. G.H." Elliot held the postcard and understood. She was alive. She'd survived the transfer, survived Camp Alva, survived whatever came after. She was alive and she'd remembered. The date wasn't arbitrary. June 28th. The day Vernon had cooked her bacon. The day she'd cried for 20 minutes because it tasted like hope. That was the day she was marking. That was the day she wanted him to remember. He put the postcard in his Bible next to her letter. And every year after that, on June 28th, another postcard would arrive. Same message, same date. A girl he'd saved, keeping her promise, letting him know that the life he'd given her was being used well. Elliot would marry in 1950. Louise, a schoolteacher from Grand Island. He'd tell her about Greta on their third date, show her the postcards, explain why June 28th mattered. Louise would understand. Would never be jealous of a German girl her husband had saved a lifetime ago. Would recognize it for what it was, a testament to mercy, a proof that kindness echoed forward through time. Their son Patrick would be born in 1953. Elliot would tell him the story when he was old enough to understand. Would teach him that the truest courage wasn't killing the enemy, it was feeding them, healing them, choosing mercy when hate would be easier. The postcards kept coming. Through the 50s, when Elliot built his practice in Grand Island, became the town doctor everyone trusted. Through the 60s, when Patrick grew up and went to college and became a lawyer. Through the 70s, when Louise died of cancer and Elliot thought his heart might finally break. That year's postcard had a pressed flower tucked inside and a note. For your loss, G. She'd known somehow, had read about it or heard about it or simply felt it across the miles. Through the 80s, when Elliot retired, when his hands weren't steady enough for medicine anymore but were still steady enough to hold the postcards that arrived every June 28th without fail. 50 years of postcards. 50 years of proof that mercy mattered. That choosing to save one life could ripple forward in ways you'd never know. June 28th, 1995. The 50th postcard arrived. Elliot was 73 now, living with Patrick and his family, his heart condition making every day uncertain. This postcard was different. The handwriting wasn't Greta's. It was younger, shakier, in a different way. Mr. Brennan, my mother passed in February. Greta Hoffman, who you knew. Her final words were, "Tell Elliot the bacon saved me." She made me promise to send this postcard. She never missed a year. Not once in 50 years. She became a nurse after the war. Worked in Brooklyn Hospital 1970 to 1990. She saved so many people, Mr. Brennan. So many. And she always said she learned how from a Jewish medic in Kansas who wasn't afraid to touch her wound. She wanted you to know your blood was not wasted. Thank you for giving my mother a chance to live. Thank you for giving me a chance to exist. Enclosed is something she wanted you to have back. Anna Hoffman, daughter. Inside the envelope was his grandmother's Star of David necklace. After 50 years, Greta had kept her promise. Never taken it off. But now, in death, she was returning it. Completing the circle. Elliot held the necklace tarnished now with 50 years of wear and understood that his life had mattered. That one choice on one morning in June had rippled forward through 5 decades, had created a life, had created meaning, had proved that mercy was stronger than hate. He died 3 months later in November 1996, holding that necklace, surrounded by family at peace. He'd lived 74 years, had saved countless lives as a doctor, had raised a good son who raised good children. But when Patrick spoke at the funeral, he didn't talk about his father's medical career or his awards or his achievements. He talked about a girl who weighed 68 pounds, about maggots and bacon and the choice to heal instead of harm. About 50 postcards that proved mercy echoed forward through generations. About a life saved that had saved other lives, that had saved still others, rippling out like waves from a stone thrown in still water. Patrick donated the 50 postcards to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. They were displayed in 1998 as part of an exhibit called The Maggots and the Bacon, Small Acts of Mercy in a Cruel War. The museum researchers uncovered Greta's full story through immigration records and hospital archives. She'd returned to Germany in 1946, worked as a nurse in Hamburg until 1969, then immigrated to America, sponsored by the American Jewish Committee. For 20 years, she worked at Brooklyn Hospital while volunteering with refugee organizations helping Holocaust survivors, Soviet Jews, anyone who'd fled horror and needed a hand to hold. The records showed she'd treated over 1,200 patients during her nursing career. But Anna's donation of her mother's diary revealed something more. One entry was marked in Greta's handwriting to be shared after she died. June 28, 1945. Today, I learned that humans are not defined by what they are taught. A Jewish man gave me bacon and taught me I deserved to live. He touched my wound when everyone else turned away. He gave his blood when I had given him only reasons to hate. I will spend the rest of my life repaying this. I will touch the wounds others fear. I will give to those who deserve only my hatred. I will choose mercy because he showed me how. The fire doesn't burn anymore. It will never burn again. Thank you, Elliot Brennan. Thank you for my life. The museum exhibit ran for 3 years. Thousands of people saw it. Saw the postcards, saw the story, saw the proof that one person choosing mercy could change the world in ways they'd never know. Saw that the smallest acts of kindness could echo forward through decades, creating ripples that touched shores you'd never see. Patrick brought his children to see it. Elliot's grandchildren standing in front of the display case, reading their grandfather's medical notes from that day in June. Reading about maggots and bacon and a choice to save instead of condemn. Learning that heroism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was just a medic with steady hands and a stubborn heart saying, "Not one more death that I could have prevented." The youngest grandchild, Sarah, named for Greta's Hebrew name that she'd reclaimed after the war, asked her father why it mattered. Why this one girl? Why this one story? Patrick knelt down to her level, showed her the final postcard, showed her the Star of David his father had kept until the day he died. Because your grandfather believed that saving one life meant saving the whole world. And he was right. That girl he saved went on to save 1,000 more. And those 1,000 people went on to have families and children and lives that mattered. Your grandfather didn't just save Greta. He saved everyone she would ever touch, everyone she would ever help. All the ripples forward through time. That's why it matters. Sarah looked at the postcards at the proof of 50 years of remembering. "Do you think she was happy?" she asked. "The girl with the maggots?" Patrick smiled. "I think she was grateful, and I think she chose to turn that gratitude into a life worth living, which is all any of us can do. We take the mercy we're given and we pass it forward. That's the job. That's what it means to be human." The exhibit closed in 2001. But the lesson remained. That mercy matters, that kindness echoes, that choosing to heal instead of harm, to save instead of condemn, to touch the wound everyone else fears, that changes the world. One person at a time, one life at a time, one act of courage at a time. Elliot Brennan touched a wound crawling with maggots and chose to heal it. Greta Hoffman lived because of that choice and spent 50 years proving that the life he saved was worth saving. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a cemetery under oak trees, there's a headstone that reads, "Greta Hoffman, 1926 to 1995, nurse, healer, survivor. The fire doesn't burn anymore." Next to it, in a plot purchased by her daughter, soil from Nebraska wheat fields was scattered, connecting two people across miles and decades and all the divisions that tried to keep them separate. Connecting mercy to gratitude, kindness to legacy, one choice to 1,000 lives saved. That's the story, not of war or victory or defeat, but of a Jewish medic from Nebraska who saw a dying German girl and decided she deserved to live, and 50 years of postcards that proved he was right. The fire doesn't burn anymore because mercy put it out. And mercy always wins in the end.